What if I told you that modern Croatians carry DNA older than the Slavs, older than Rome, older than agriculture itself? Because this isn't just a poetic metaphor. It's a measurable scientific fact. Beneath every modern identity, behind every border and every language, lies a genetic story. And Croatia's story is one of the oldest still visible in Europe today. It begins with a Y DNA haplogroup known as I2A, carried by nearly 40% of Croatian men. But here's the shocker. This lineage didn't arrive with the Slavs. It originated over 25,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum, when most of Europe was covered in ice, and humans had to retreat to survival zones. The Balkans were one of those zones, a genetic sanctuary. As temperatures dropped, ancient hunter-gatherers took shelter in caves, valleys, and forested highlands across this region, isolated for thousands of years, passing down their DNA like an uninterrupted time capsule. They didn't write, they didn't farm, but they survived, and in Croatia their legacy endures in the blood. Modern science backs this with hard evidence. A 13,500-year-old skeleton found in Switzerland, carrying haplogroup FUMS2A, has genetic matches to people living in the Dinaric Alps today. But it doesn't stop there. In Vindiga Cave, northern Croatia, researchers discovered a 52,000-year-old Neanderthal genome, one of the most complete ever sequenced. This ancient relative shares more in common with modern Europeans than any previously studied Neanderthal. In fact, scientists estimate that 1.8% to 2.4% of modern Croatian DNA is Neanderthal in origin, influencing immune function, skin adaptation, and even behaviour. So when we say Croatian DNA is a time machine, we mean it quite literally. It contains markers from Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, Neanderthals, and Anatolian farmers, all layered in the same genome. It's not a straight line. It's a spiral through time. Yet the dominant narrative still starts in the 7th century, with the arrival of Slavic tribes. So ask yourself, if Croats carry Ice Age DNA, if their genes survived empires, migrations, even extinction events, why do our history books begin only 1,400 years ago? But what if the true founders of Croatia were never supposed to be remembered at all? Before there was Croatia, there were only survivors, hiding in Europe's last sanctuary from the ice. Because they weren't kings, they weren't warriors, they weren't even farmers, they were survivors, forgotten, anonymous, who outlived a world-ending winter. Before there was Croatia, before there were borders, flags, or even farms, there was ice, and only ice. Around 26,500 years ago, the last glacial maximum buried most of Europe under unlivable cold. Forests turned to tundra, rivers froze solid, northern tribes vanished. But one place stayed warm enough to breathe. The Balkan Peninsula, carved by rivers, shielded by mountains, became a genetic lifeboat, a frozen Europe's final cradle of life. Inside that cradle, a small band of Western hunter-gatherers held on, for generations, isolated, starving, silent, yet enduring. Their legacy lives in a genetic signature, haplogroup I2A in men and mtDNA U5 and U4 in women. These aren't just lines on a chart, they are the literal echoes of Ice Age blood. And that same signature still pulses in the people of Croatia today. How do we know? Because in 2014, scientists analysing ancient DNA in a 13,500-year-old skeleton from Switzerland, marked by I2A, found a shocking match, not to modern Swiss, not to Germans, but to Croatians in the Dinaric Alps. It's not myth, it's mitochondria. Even before farming was invented, before the wheel turned, before language had grammar, this DNA was already here. They didn't build empires, they didn't write anything down, but these people, trapped between glaciers and hunger, survived where others disappeared. And their genes became the foundation of what we now call the Croatian genome. No conquest, no banner, just the sheer will to endure. And what's even more haunting, their world never came back. Because by around 6000 BCE, the ice was melting, and across the Adriatic and Danube. But then a second people arrived, not to conquer, but to transform everything. How do you replace a people without war? Through wheat, not weapons. And they didn't bring swords. They brought seeds. Around 6000 BCE, as the Ice Age retreated and forests crept northward, a quiet revolution crossed the waters from Anatolia. A new people stepped into the Balkans, not hunters, but farmers. They carried no armies, yet they changed everything. This was the Neolithic transition, and with it came not just farming, but new rituals, new tools, and most importantly, new DNA. Croatia became one of the first frontiers of this massive genetic shift. Ancient skeletons from Neolithic graves, studied in labs across Europe, show a near-complete overwrite of the previous genome. Anatolian farmer ancestry made up 97.6% to 100% of the DNA in early Neolithic Croatian remains. That's not a blend, that's a replacement. Lineages like Y-DNA, G2A, mtDNA, N1A, T2K, all foreign to the Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, suddenly dominate. The indigenous I2A line fades, almost like a memory being erased. This wave wasn't violent, it was domestic. It came with pottery, grains and livestock. And yet, it was just as permanent as war. They built the Starchevo culture, some of Europe's oldest permanent settlements. Villages lined with ceramic storage pits and woven thatched roofs. But beneath the surface, something darker lived. In 2020, genomic analysis of a Neolithic Croatian burial site revealed patterns of repeated cousin marriages, endogamy, isolation. Genetic bottlenecks are so tight, some villages may have collapsed under their own bloodlines. So the very people who replaced the hunters began to fold in on themselves. They were builders. But they were also sealed off, controlled, carefully breeding behind clay walls. And just as their roots reached deep into Balkan soil, thunder rolled from the east. What happens when a language, a bloodline, and a burial ritual arrive on horseback? And this time, it wasn't a metaphor. Somewhere around 3000 BCE, the soil of Eastern Europe began to tremble under the hooves of strangers. These were not farmers, not settlers. These were the Yamnaya, pastoral warriors from the Pontic Caspian steppe, now southern Ukraine and southwest Russia. They didn't arrive gently. They brought horses, wagons, bronze axes, and a transformation that would ripple across the entire continent. And their DNA came with them. Within just a few generations, the ancient hunter-farmer fusion of the Balkans was interrupted, overwritten by a new genetic wave, marked by Y chromosome haplogroups R1A and R1b. In the Balkans, and what is now Croatia, this collision wasn't total destruction, it was hybridization. Steppe herders fused with Neolithic farmers, creating entirely new cultural forms. One of them would become the Proto-Illyrians. Archaeologists see the impact in graves. Burial mounds called kurgans, bodies laid beneath stone circles, facing the rising sun. Men buried with weapons. Women with amber beads and copper pins. These weren't just graves, they were manifestos, statements of power, hierarchy, and belief. And the shift was massive. R1A, the lineage linked with Yamnaya and later Slavic expansion, began its slow climb in frequency. R1b, tied to Western movements, and possibly the Celts, also entered the scene. But it's R1a in particular that would rise to define future Croatian male lines, especially in the north and east. This wasn't just about genes. The Yamnaya also brought something intangible, but just as invasive: language. They carried the early branches of what would become Indo-European, the root of Slavic, Latin, Germanic and Greek. When these horsemen rode in, they weren't just moving bodies, they were planting the foundations of how future people would speak, pray and bury their dead. A new order was forming, one with bronze blades, wheeled war carts, and bloodlines that would stretch all the way to modern Croats. But if this was the beginning of transformation, the real reshaping was still centuries away, hidden behind the fall of Rome. What if Rome ruled the Balkans without truly changing its people? Because when the Roman Empire expanded into the Balkans, something strange happened. The cities changed, but the people didn't. For 500 years, Rome built walls, roads, and marble temples across what is now Croatia. Provinces like Dalmatia and Pannonia were absorbed, fortified, mapped. Latin names replaced Illyrian ones. And yet, when scientists opened graves from the Roman era, the DNA inside was familiar. In 2023, a landmark archaeogenetic study analysed 136 ancient genomes from the first millennium across the Balkans. Their goal? To trace the biological imprint of Roman occupation. The result? Almost no Italic DNA. None from the Italian peninsula where the empire began. Instead, a mosaic: Anatolian, North African, steppe, Levantine, even a few from deep in Central Europe. A swirl of military recruits, traders and slaves, but not a large-scale Italian migration. The most shocking find came from a Croatian skeleton dated to 260 to 402 CE, right in the heart of Roman power. His genome matches almost perfectly with modern southeastern Europeans. He wasn't a Roman newcomer, he was us. So what was Romanization, if not genetic change? It was the law, architecture, roads that still cut across the mountains today. But under every polished mosaic floor, the same ancient blood flowed. Paleolithic, Neolithic, Bronze Age, still alive beneath the imperial surface. And this wasn't just theory. Multiple sites, from Salona to Vinkovci, show consistent genetic continuity. Even while inscriptions changed from Illyrian to Latin, even as Roman coins replaced tribal barter, the people themselves stayed. They didn't vanish. They adapted. Because Rome wasn't a people. It was a system. And when that system fell, when emperors collapsed and legions retreated, it didn't leave behind a Roman population. It left something else. Then came the flood. Not of legions, but of tribes. They came speaking a new language, but carrying ancient blood. Then came the flood. Not of legions, but of tribes. And with them came the story Croatians are told about who they are. It was the 6th century. The Roman Empire, once a steel spine across Europe, had crumbled. Into its shadow, a new people moved south. They didn't bring catapults or siege towers. They brought cattle, Slavic words, and a language no one in Dalmatia had ever heard before. They were the early Slavs, migrating en masse into the Balkans, and eventually across half of Europe. Their Y-DNA carried a signature almost like a stamp. R1-Z282, a distinct marker tracing back to the forest steppe zones of Eastern Europe. This lineage spread fast, from the Dnieper to the Adriatic, reshaping demographics, language and culture. But here's the twist: the deeper genetic studies go, the stranger the story becomes. Because in modern-day Croatians, another lineage, one far older, starts to rise after the Slavs arrive. Itua-din, a branch of the same ancient Itua found in Ice Age refugia, suddenly explodes in frequency. This Paleolithic survivor, once nearly wiped out by Neolithic farmers, begins dominating the Y chromosome pool. How? One theory stands out: the founder effect. Picture a demographic vacuum after centuries of war and plague. A few local lineages, possibly elite families of I2A descent, mix into the incoming Slavic-speaking population. Their blood, now inside a rising social structure, multiplies exponentially over generations, not through conquest, through survival and social reproduction. So the Slavs arrived, but they didn't replace. They blended. Burial customs from this time show mixed signals. Cremation paired with inhumation, Slavic pottery beside pre-Roman artifacts. Even languages began merging, absorbing older Illyrian and Latin sounds into Slavic roots. What came out was neither the past nor the invader. It was something new, a hybrid identity. But under this identity, the ancient genome stayed. Croatia became Slavic by speech, but in blood it remembered something deeper, something cold, something that had survived ice, empire and extinction. And yet even that memory may be a mask. But what if the Slavic identity itself was a cultural costume hiding something older? Could an entire ruling class disappear and leave no trace? Because history whispers that Croatia may once have been ruled not by slaves alone, but by a shadow elite. Legends whisper of the Sarmatians, Iranian-speaking nomads from the steppes, who could have led early Croats as a warrior class. You might have heard the name Hrvat and dismissed it as purely Slavic, but the trail doesn't point west, it bends east. Linguists trace Hrvat back to Iranian roots, possibly from Proto-Ossetian Zervat, meaning guardian or protector, a title, not a tribe, borrowed into Slavic before the 7th century. Evidence? The Tanais tablets, carved in the 2nd to 3rd century AD near the Sea of Azov, list names like Horoathos and Koroathos, strikingly similar to Hrvat. Could those Sarmatian names be echoes of a forgotten elite? But when we look at the DNA, that elite vanishes too. Modern genetic surveys show almost no presence of typically Iranian haplogroups like Q, T or H in Croatians. Sure, one rare subbranch, G1 associated with Iran, was found in a Croatian sample for the first time, but it's so rare it reads like a historical footnote. So here's the twist. The story of Sarmatian leadership may be more myth than bloodline. The elite may have imposed names, customs, maybe even titles like Hrvat, but if they had power, they left no lasting genetic mark. That irony echoes through the centuries. The rulers who remade identities disappeared into their own people, their blood erased, their legacy survived only in language. And that begs a deeper question. Who really built Croatia? The rulers, or those they ruled? And then came another silence, broken by Ottoman drums. For 400 years they ruled, yet left less than 3% in the blood. The 15th century opened with fire. Fortresses fell, borders collapsed, and the crescent flag rose over Croatian soil. For the next 400 years, vast parts of the Balkans, from Slavonia to central Bosnia, lived under Ottoman command. And yet, when we tested the DNA of Croatians today, something remarkable happened. Almost nothing changes. Autosomal analysis reveals that Ottoman genetic input in Croatia hovers around 2 to 3%, and that includes mixed ancestry from soldiers, administrators, and Balkan converts alike. The Y DNA impact, the male line, is even smaller. Haplogroups like J2E1B1b in G, typically associated with Turkish or Middle Eastern lineages, appear occasionally, but never in dominant numbers. The core remains untouched. I2-Din still rules the southern bloodlines. R1a, rising from earlier Slavic layers, still pulses in the north. It's a paradox of power. The Ottomans could tax, govern, conscript, but not transform. Even language held firm. Croatian survived beside Turkish, Arabic and Persian script. Church bells still rang under the shadow of minarets. The deeper force was resistance through identity. Croatian customs, from glagolitic script to folk dress, stayed rooted. The Catholic Church, though sometimes pushed underground, preserved continuity. Even where Islam spread, the shift was often pragmatic, not total. Genetically, the land remembered who it was, long before empires came. There were, of course, scars, refugees flow, border wars, new surnames. Yet at the deepest level, in the double helix, nothing broke. Dynasties changed, but the DNA stood still. And that's the haunting beauty of Balkan genetics. It's not the rulers who shape a people. It's the quiet survival of what lies beneath. Because even the empire can't overwrite memory buried in bone. But even deeper than dynasties is the code written in our cells. What if the map of Croatia was drawn, not by borders, but by DNA strands, beneath flags, beneath faith, beneath the names we call ourselves lies something older, something unclaimed, a map made not with ink, but with inheritance. When scientists charted the haplogroups of modern Croats, a striking pattern emerged. In the rugged spine of the Dinaric Alps, one lineage dominates, I2-Din, a genetic fingerprint stretching back over 25,000 years. Older than slaves, older than Rome, older than agriculture itself. Travel north, and the pattern shifts. In the Pannonian Basin, near the Hungarian border, a different marker rises, R1a, tracing the legacy of steppe riders, Slavic settlers, and Indo-European speech. These aren't just random codes, they are anchors to ancestors who never saw a flag, never heard the word Croatia, but whose blood still flows. And here's the twist. When we look deeper into autosomal DNA, the complex full-body inheritance passed from both parents, borders begin to blur. Across Bosnia, Serbia, Montenegro, there is overlap. Genetically, Croats, Serbs and Bosniaks often share more with each other than with their distant political allies. Ancient migrations didn't follow today's maps. Empires rose, borders shifted, faiths divided, but the genes remained intertwined. So what does it really mean to say I am Croatian? Is it language, a last name, a flag, or is it a thread that survived glaciations, invasions, conversions and collapse? Maybe identity isn't about purity. Maybe it's about memory, the kind that doesn't fade, even when rewritten. Bones, remember. Long after kings are buried, after borders are redrawn, after churches and mosques swap places, the DNA still tells the truth. But the truth doesn't end here, because if I2A and R1A form the deep skeleton of Croatia's past, there's still something deeper, an even older ghost in the bloodstream, a fragment of something that predates us all. And yet, this isn't the oldest layer. There's one more hidden ancestor. What if Croatia's deepest roots aren't even human? One that didn't build cities, didn't speak in full sentences, didn't plant wheat or shape metal. Because deep in northern Croatia, inside a limestone cave called Vindiga, scientists made a discovery that rewrote what it means to be us. A bone fragment, 52,000 years old, from a species that walked like us, but wasn't us, Neanderthals. And that tiny fragment, buried in the cold earth of a Croatian cave, holds one of the most complete Neanderthal genomes ever found. Not from Africa, not from Western Europe, from here. And when modern geneticists compared that DNA, they were stunned. Modern humans, especially those of European and Central Asian descent, carry 1.8 to 2.4% Neanderthal DNA. That includes modern Croatians. It's in the immune system, in the way skin responds to sunlight, even in how our bodies metabolize fat and process sugar. That means if you're watching this from Zagreb or Split or Osijek, there's a piece of you that isn't Homo sapiens, and it's not random. The Vindija genome is the closest match ever found to the actual Neanderthals, who bred with the ancestors of non-African humans. The interbreeding likely happened in southeastern Europe, maybe not far from this very cave. So when we say Croatia is a crossroads, that it's been touched by waves of farmers, warriors, empires and tribes, we're missing the deeper truth. It's not just a crossroads, it's a time tunnel, a rare place on Earth where you can stand on soil and touch every layer of human evolution, including the layers that came before humans. Before Croats, before Slavs, before Rome, there was something else here, and it didn't vanish. It lives on, in your white blood cells, in the colour of your skin, in the shape of your skull. We've always thought we were alone in the story of humanity, but the bones of Croatia say otherwise. And if that cave held the past, what secrets are still buried beneath our feet? What if your DNA could rewrite the story of nations? The truth is, we're not just uncovering old bones, we're peeling back entire civilizations, one genome at a time. Because Croatia, this small nation by the sea, is not a single story. It's a palimpsest, a layered manuscript of human survival rewritten again and again. First came the Ice Age hunters, then the Anatolian farmers, after them the thunder of the steppe. Rome marched through, Slavs reshaped the map, and empires tried to redraw it in their own image. But now, for the first time, we don't have to guess. Inside Zagreb's ancient DNA labs, scientists are sequencing the past. One tooth, one femur, one forgotten grave at a time. And what they're finding doesn't match the textbooks. Genetics is telling a different story than politics, a quieter one. Because when you zoom into the autosomal DNA, the borders disappear. You don't see Croat versus Serb. You don't see Catholic versus Orthodox. You see cousins, split apart by kingdoms, but tied together by blood. This isn't about dissolving identity. It's about deepening it. Your surname, your language, your traditions, they matter. But beneath them all is something older, something unshakable. That's what DNA reveals. That identity isn't about walls or flags. It's about resilience, about surviving ice ages, empires and silence, and still being here. Every fragment we find, every genome we decode, pulls another lost voice from the earth. And the next voice we'll listen to, it's waiting in the soil of central Turkey. What happens when we compare Croatian DNA to the heart of Anatolia?